Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. And um, today we're going to be looking at the idea of power dynamics,
Whoa.
specifically how our perceptions of power can shift when people move between groups.
Yeah.
Now, we're drawing on a really fascinating article from the Academy of Management Review called For All, or One and One for All: The Development and Transfer of Power Across Organizational Levels.
Okay.
It was written by Fiol, O'Connor, and Aquinas.
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 So like the beer.
Yeah, just like the beer. A Guinness.
Okay.
So I think everyone has probably had this experience of joining a new team,
Yeah.
maybe at work, maybe a social club, and like having your perception of like who the powerful people were
Right.
change over time.
Yeah,
And
definitely.
that's exactly what this article gets into.
It's super interesting. I mean, it's a topic that I think we can all relate to on some level. You
Yeah.
know, we've all been in those situations where you walk into a room and you're not quite sure
Right.
who to listen to, who to follow,
Totally.
who's got the real influence.
So I guess to start off, like the article makes a really important distinction
Mm-hmm.
between formal power, like having a certain title,
Right.
and what they call perceived power,
Yeah.
which is uh, really about like how much influence other people think you have.
That's the key, right? It's not just about what's on paper, it's about what people believe.
Totally.
And they have this really great example that they use in the article about a nurse, a physician, and an administrator all joining a new surgical unit at a hospital.
Okay.
And so they all three have kind of similar hierarchical positions within the hospital structure,
Okay.
but the team might have totally different perceptions of
Yeah.
who holds the power, like before they even see them in action,
Yeah. Almost
based on, just our own experiences.
Right. It's like we already have these ideas about what a nurse is.
Exactly.
And a doctor.
Yeah, and administrators. Don't forget those.
Yeah, exactly.
It's just,
So
right?
totally. So it's like those pre-existing ideas almost color how we see their power
Right.
before we even like
I think so. I think it definitely plays a role.
interact with them.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, so then it gets even more interesting
Okay.
because they introduce this concept of power mental models,
Yeah, or PMMs as they call them.
PMMs.
Yeah, it sounds a little jargony.
It
but
sounds so jargy.
it's a really simple idea once you break it down.
Okay, so break it down for us.
Basically, PMMs are just these mental shortcuts that we all use to make sense of power dynamics.
Oh,
Kind of like our internal rule book for who's got the juice, who's influential.
I like that.
And there's two main types, right?
Okay.
So there's our own identity PMM,
Mm-hmm.
which is all about how much power we think we have personally.
Okay.
And then there's the reputation PMM, which is how we judge the power of other people.
Yeah.
So it's like our internal scorecard, who's got clout, who doesn't.
Right.
And the interesting thing is these two things don't always line up.
Right. So like I might think I'm super powerful,
Right, exactly.
but nobody else agrees.
You could be walking around thinking you're the CEO and everybody else is like, who is this person?
Exactly. So there can be like a gap,
Yeah, a mismatch.
a mismatch between my identity PMM
Uh-huh.
and how other people actually see me.
Totally. And that's one of the things that this article really highlights
Yep.
is that those PMMs, those internal beliefs about power, they can actually influence how we interpret someone's actions
Right.
and how easily we kind of accept or reject, shifts in power dynamics.
Oh, that's so interesting.
It is.
So how does that actually play out? Like
Yeah.
when somebody gets promoted or like even on the flip side, like maybe somebody takes a step back in their career.
Right.
How do those perceptions transfer?
Well, the study suggests that upward shifts, like promotions, are often easier for us to kind of swallow
Yeah.
because they tend to confirm our existing beliefs.
Right. Right.
Like if we already thought someone was competent and influential, seeing them get promoted,
Oh, yeah. It all makes sense.
it just reinforces that view.
Totally. It's that I knew it more.
Exactly. It's like we have this sense of like, oh yeah, they were always destined for greatness.
Exactly. But what about the opposite?
What about when someone moves to a less powerful position?
Right. How does that work?
That's where things get really interesting and potentially trickier
Okay.
because those downward shifts can actually challenge those preconceived notions that we have
Oh,
and make it harder for us to adjust our power perceptions.
wow. So it's not even like just about the individual.
It's not just about them.
and their capability.
It's about how our own mental models and our biases
Yeah.
are kind of coloring how we see those transitions.
Right. So the big question, I guess, is like, how do we overcome that?
Yeah, how do we get past those biases?
Right. How do we actually see someone's like true power regardless of their position?
That's a great question.
And like, does the article have any insights into like,
They do, actually.
Right.
They talk about the role of outsiders and how outsiders can be really important in shaping how other people view
okay,
those downward power shifts.
interesting. Okay, so let's dig into that.
Yeah.
Who are these outsiders?
Yeah, who are these outsiders and how do they fit into this whole picture? So outsiders are basically people who are new to the group or the situation.
Okay.
They haven't had time to form those preconceived notions that the insiders might have.
Right.
So they bring like a fresh perspective,
Okay.
which can be super valuable.
That makes sense.
You know, like imagine a respected leader takes a step back,
Yeah.
maybe into like a mentorship role or something.
Oh.
An outsider who's worked with them before
Yeah.
could vouch for their expertise, even if their titles change,
Right.
you
Yeah.
know,
Makes sense.
because they've seen it firsthand.
Right. Right.
They've got that direct experience
Okay.
with the person's capabilities.
And the article highlights that this is particularly important
Yeah.
for those reputation PMMs, right?
Oh, absolutely.
The ones that other people have about someone's power.
Yeah, those are the ones that are toughest to shift.
Right.
Because, you know, it's one thing to change your own mind about someone's power
Right.
based on new information.
Right.
But trying to change an entire group's perception,
Right.
that can be a real challenge.
Yeah.
It's like, you know, we as humans, we tend to rely on these mental shortcuts.
Okay.
And one of the shortcuts that psychologists talk about is something called base rates.
Base rates. What is that?
So a base rate is basically the general frequency of something occurring.
Okay.
So like, you know, if we typically see CEOs as powerful figures,
Right.
that becomes our base rate for CEO power.
Right.
Right.
Okay.
So then when we see someone who deviates from that base rate,
Oh,
like a CEO stepping down to a less prominent role,
it throws us off.
it can totally throw us off.
Okay.
Because it doesn't fit our expectations.
Yeah. It's like our brains are wired
Yeah.
to expect certain things.
Right.
And then when that doesn't happen,
It's like, wait a minute.
yeah, exactly.
What's going on here?
We don't know how to process it.
Exactly. So in those situations,
Yeah.
outsiders can be really crucial.
Yeah.
Because they can provide that counter evidence
Okay.
that challenges those base rate assumptions.
So it's almost like it's not even just about the individual advocating for themselves.
It's bigger than that.
It's about having like
It's about creating an environment where those outside perspectives
yeah.
are valued and can actually shape those perceptions.
Right. Right.
You know,
Totally.
it's not just about one person shouting from the rooftops,
Right.
hey, I'm still powerful.
Yeah.
It's about having other people
Right.
who can corroborate that.
Interesting. And
Yeah.
do the researchers talk about like
They do, actually.
Okay.
They talk about how organizations themselves
Ugh,
can
yeah.
play a role
Interesting.
in smoothing out these power transitions.
Okay, so what can organizations do?
Well, for starters,
Yeah.
they can foster a culture that values expertise and experience,
Right.
regardless of someone's formal title.
So it's not just about
It's not just about where you sit on the org chart.
right. It's about what you actually know.
Exactly. It's about the value you bring.
Gotcha.
You know, the knowledge, the skills,
Okay.
the experience.
And are there any other like concrete things?
Yeah, there are.
Okay.
So they also talk about how organizations can implement systems
Okay.
that allow individuals to kind of showcase their skills
Okay.
and their contributions.
So like giving them a platform.
Yeah,
Exact to show off what they know.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You know, even if they're in a role that's not traditionally seen as super high powered,
Right.
you can still create opportunities for them to
Yeah.
demonstrate their expertise.
Okay.
So things like, you know, maybe giving them opportunities to lead projects or
Yeah.
to share their knowledge with others,
Well,
even if they're not managing people in a traditional sense.
Right, right.
It's about creating those opportunities for people to shine.
That makes sense. It's like giving them a chance to prove themselves.
Exactly. And to let their true power shine through.
So it sounds like we've uncovered some pretty valuable insights today.
I think so.
You know, we've explored how power is perceived,
Yeah.
the influence of these mental models,
Yeah.
and how outsiders can be really important in shaping those perceptions.
Especially during those downward transitions.
Right.
It's a really fascinating area.
It is. It is.
And I think it's something that we can all learn from.
Totally. So before we wrap up,
Yeah.
I want to leave our listener with something to think about.
Okay.
Um, think back to a time when you joined a new group.
Hmm.
Could be at work, a social club, even just like a new circle of friends.
Yeah, any new environment, really, where you had to
Yeah.
kind of figure out the power dynamics.
How did your perception of those dynamics change over time?
Yeah, what shifted for you?
What factors influence those shifts?
Were there any moments where your initial impressions
Yeah.
were challenged or confirmed?
Yeah, that's a really good point.
And how did those evolving power dynamics ultimately shape your experience
Yeah,
in that group?
that is fascinating.
It is, right.
Yeah.
It's these subtle things that we don't always think about, but
Right.
they really do have a big impact.
Totally. Well, this has been a really great deep dive.
I agree.
We've uncovered some really cool stuff about power and perception.
Yeah, the hidden dynamics of power.
Right, right.
It's always fascinating to explore those.
Okay, well, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And until next time, keep exploring and stay curious. Welcome back, everyone. We've been talking about how our ideas about power can actually change, especially when someone moves to a position that, might seem less powerful at first glance. Before the break, we asked you to think about a time when you joined a new group and how those power dynamics shifted over time.
It's really eye-opening, isn't it? Just paying attention to those little changes.
It really is. So let's wrap this up. What are the big takeaways here? What should our listeners really remember?
I think the biggest thing is that power is, well, it's subjective. It's really in the eye of the beholder. It's not just about the title you have or even how much influence you actually have. It's about how other people see you.
So even if someone's in a role that might traditionally seem less powerful, they could still have a ton of influence depending on how other people perceive them.
Exactly. And that's why understanding those power mental models, those PMMs we talked about, is so important. We all have these mental shortcuts we use when we're trying to figure out who has power, who to listen to. And sometimes those shortcuts can make us miss someone's true potential.
So being aware of those mental models, both our own and those of the people around us, can really help us see things more clearly.
Absolutely. And if you're someone who's moved to a position that might be perceived as less powerful, don't be afraid to highlight your skills and your experience, even if they aren't super obvious in your new role.
Right. It's all about showing your value and making sure people recognize what you bring to the table. And as we talked about earlier, outsiders can play a big part in that. If you have someone who knows what you're capable of and is willing to speak up for you, that can make a huge difference.
Totally. And finally, never underestimate the power of good communication. Whether you're moving up or down, be upfront about your expectations, your strengths, and how you plan to contribute in your new position.
Basically, setting yourself up for success and making sure everyone's on the same page.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
This has been a really fascinating deep dive. We've learned so much about how power is perceived, how those mental models come into play, and how we can navigate those shifts, especially when someone moves to a position that might not seem as powerful on the surface.
And how we can all work together to create a more inclusive view of what power really means.
Exactly. Thanks for joining us on this journey. We'll see you next time for another deep dive.